Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this special program. Mount Rushmore stands as a tribute to perseverance and resilience, and so that is the theme for our program this evening. We are so excited to have you be a part of this and to help us celebrate 80 years since the completion of the carving of Mount Rushmore, and that will take place tomorrow, October 31st, 2021. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy our program this evening. Thank you again for all that you do to support the mission of the National Park Service and to the Mount Rushmore Society. There is so much to celebrate. With any great vision, there are challenges to solve, resistance to change, and obstacles to overcome. We've asked author and historian Tom Griffith, former National Park Service Superintendent Dan Wank, and current Superintendent Michelle Wheatley to reflect on how Mount Rushmore visionaries, workers, and supporters have persevered and demonstrated resilience over the years to create, enhance, and maintain a park of national significance. The lessons of perseverance carry us today. We can find great lessons from the past that still inspire us today.
Gutzon Borglum believed that Mount Rushmore would be his ticket to immortality, and indeed it has been. The first question people ask isn't just necessarily about the 4 presidents depicted on the mountain, but who carved it? And Borglum hoped to achieve there something that would be immeasurable, something that would be on such a scale. And he recognized that America, following World War I, was feeling somewhat cocky. And he thought that a mountain would symbolize in stone the spirit of a nation. And that's what he attempted to create. In the 4 figures, he's depicting the birth, growth, preservation, and development of an America that we know today, but at Thomas Jefferson's time didn't even extend from coast to coast. Fortunately, the Louisiana Purchase rectified that. A few years before Gutzon Borglum's arrival at Mount Rushmore, he was in fact carving a giant wall of rock at Stone Mountain, Georgia, intended to be a Confederate memorial. In the process of doing that, he attempted many different techniques, most of which involved projecting a drawing of what would be the sculpture onto the face of the mountain itself. That proved really very difficult, taking a 2.5-inch slide and projecting it onto a mountain at about 1,000 times the scale. So he eventually perfected that, was able to have Tucker, one of his assistants, actually paint lines on the mountain at Stone Mountain, Georgia. Then he came the carving, and his men began actually chiseling that mountain face and realized that they could spend the rest of their lives doing just that and never finish the sculpture itself. So he went to DuPont, then the largest explosive company in the world, which sent its experts to Stone Mountain. And there he perfected a system that involved a series of honeycombed or precise depth drill marks, followed by powdermen who would put in those holes precise amounts of explosives, sometimes as little as a 1/2 ounce of dynamite in each hole, and began blasting. That proved very effective and allowed them to actually advance the work in rapid succession, and allowed them to have the portrait of General Lee come out of the mountain within a matter of months. When that project folded and Borglum left in a controversy, he came to Mount Rushmore at the invitation of Doane Robinson, our state historian, who originally envisioned Western figures carved from the needles in the southern Black Hills. When Borglum looked at those needles and tested that rock, he determined that it was too brittle for carving, and that the needles themselves were not conducive to the human form. In fact, they would have looked like pinheads. So he looked for another mountain, a suitable mass of rock, a southeasterly exposure, which would allow the greatest sunlight through the majority of the day, and stumbled on a little known craggy granite outcropping called Mount Rushmore, which had been named years earlier for a New York City attorney, Charles Rushmore. He began testing that rock and actually spent days looking at its fissures and its crags to see what manner of sculpture he could actually produce. His greatest fear was below the surface of the rock, there would be schist, a very brittle substance that emanated from the upthrust of the Black Hills. And he was afraid those schist deposits would be hidden under the surface of that rock and over time present an insurmountable challenge. Fortunately, Gutzon Borglum knew what he was doing from his experience at Stone Mountain and began using the same techniques at Mount Rushmore. He first made a model of what he hoped to achieve, and then would transfer from the model to the mountain precise measurements using a plumb bob system. That proved to be very effective because as the carvers, and namely Borglum, but the 400 men who would assist him over the next 14 years learned that while you were on the face of the mountain, you couldn't see its totality. You couldn't see really even where you were in relation to the sculpture itself. So he not only used the plumb bob system, but he used models and masks and then transferred those precise measurements to the mountain. Thomas Jefferson probably provided the greatest challenge. Initially, he was placed to the left of George Washington. In fact, I have a picture of my mother in 1932 as a 6-year-old standing in front of Mount Rushmore, and Thomas Jefferson is emerging from the rock to the left of George. Well, today we know he's on the right, but that year, late 20s, after George's figure was completed, they started on Thomas Jefferson. They worked 8 months on putting him on the left side of George. And coincidentally, that same year, Borglum was gone a great portion of the year while Thomas is being carved and his assistants are working on that figure. Borglum was in Poznan, Poland, dedicating his Woodrow Wilson sculpture at that time and placing it. And when he returned, it's said that he could see from Iron Mountain Road some 2 miles away that Thomas didn't look right. And in fact, they encountered quartz and other poor rock that eventually led to the decision to blow that figure completely off the mountain and start Thomas Jefferson to the right of George Washington. In sculpture, the only art where you take away, that you generally block out your form. And they blocked out Thomas Jefferson in a rough stage and discovered as they roughed him out that a crack extended right through the middle of his nose. So in the roughing out stage, Borglum tilted Thomas Jefferson's head. Today we might look at Mount Rushmore and think of Thomas Jefferson as the visionary of the group. He wrote the Declaration of Independence when he was 35. His own library becomes the basis for the Library of Congress. But in that stage, Borglum was so worried about the noses because a vast quantity of very heavy rock with no underlying support could lead to problems years down the line. And he wanted this to be a monument for the ages. So he tilted that head upwards, a little skyward, and that crack then extended down his right lip. When they had that figure almost completed, it looked, because due to a piece of quartz, it looked like Thomas Jefferson had a giant cold sore on his right lip. Well, Borglum fortunately had a master Italian marble cutter on staff who went in and cut a 1 square foot block out of that lip, removing the quartz, and then replaced it with a perfect stone and sealed it. And today, it's the only patch on Mount Rushmore. You know, safety was one of Gutzon Borglum's biggest concerns. He knew that the fact that they were blasting with dynamite twice a day. He had men hanging in bosun's chairs from cables strapped to a winch on top of the mountain. And he worried about his men. Understand, he was never chummy with them. He was more like an officer in a military corps. And he treated his own men with respect and worried about them on a daily basis. You know, some of his workers would later say he was the hardest man they ever had to work with, but they never doubted his sincerity or his dedication to creating a work that would stand for the ages. And they realized that when they would watch him in the mornings running his hand down these 1,000-strand cables on which their own seats would be suspended off of a cliff. And if one strand was broken, he would have that whole cable replaced. It's amazing that in doing so, 6.5 years of work over a 14-year period, that no one was killed. By comparison, the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, built in the 1980s, 11 men died doing that one building. And I think it's true testament to his concern for his men and the skill with which he approached that whole work, that nobody died and there were only a very few serious incidents. Mount Rushmore in the ensuing 14 years was plagued by a lack of funds and certainly by weather. And so they were often stalled by lack of money. They were stalled by weather that didn't allow them to work on the mountain. And they were stalled by a thing called the Great Depression, the Dirty 30s, when virtually every ranch and farmer in South Dakota was plagued by not only a lack of markets, but by a drought and by grasshoppers that consumed virtually everything they could grow. And the whole world was in a financial crisis at that point. So raising money for an extravagance such as Mount Rushmore proved to be a great challenge. In 1931, the Mount Rushmore Society, the nonprofit group that still stands by Mount Rushmore today, was broke. They had thousands of dollars in debt. They had $500 in the bank, and that led to stalling the work and any progress on the mountain through virtually all of 1932. Fortunately, the federal government and our senators and congressmen decided that Mount Rushmore was worthy as a make-work project, similar to the CCC, the WPA, the TVA, and decided that putting money forth, federal money, public money, toward a monument for the ages was indeed worthwhile. And that's what kept Mount Rushmore flowing and moving forward through the next 14 years. Someone once asked Gutzon Borglum how tall these men would have been had they been carved head to toe, and he responded, 365 feet tall, able to wade the Potomac without getting their knees wet. They would have had to bend down, he said, to read by the light from the torch of the Statue of Liberty. He intended, as the models show us today in the sculptor's studio, to carve them from the waist up. Unfortunately, by 1938, Poland was invaded. America, under FDR, is soon doing battleships for bases with the UK, and the war clouds have formed in Europe. Inevitably, America would become involved in that. So he understood, and Congress directed him to concentrate on the faces and not include this 700-step grand stairway to the Hall of Records directly in a canyon behind the faces, and to concentrate purely on the sculpture itself. So by 1940, Congress has said you can't work on the Hall of Records, you got to concentrate on the faces. And if you look at Mount Rushmore today, what you're really looking at is an unfinished dream. You'll see the lapels on George's figure coming out. You'll see 4 nubs under Lincoln's chin that were intended to be a hand gripping his lapel. But those were never realized. In March of 1941, Borglum dies, leaving his son, who was just a teenager when he first arrived there, to shut down the work and complete some finishing touches. By October 31st, Halloween Day of 1941, all the scaffolding had been removed. The drills had been silenced, and as my great friend, the late great author Rex Allen Smith said, they returned the mountain to the eternal silence from which they had awakened it 14 years earlier. And in fact, Mount Rushmore was not even dedicated until its 50th anniversary in 1991.
Mount Rushmore, once it was completed, really became a destination for many people across America. Then certainly it grew into a destination for people from around the world. And the national parks became increasingly important, and Mount Rushmore became increasingly important to that. As people traveled west and they were going to places like Yellowstone and Grand Teton or Yosemite or the parks of the Northwest, Mount Rushmore was a stop. Mount Rushmore kept growing in importance and significance to places like South Dakota for tourism, and they kept advertising. And really what happened is the National Park Service made considerable investments in Mount Rushmore in the 1960s. New visitor center, built new concession facilities. We built the pathways. We did the things that were necessary to accommodate an increasing load of visitation. However, no one really anticipated the kind of visitation that would occur in the 70s and really the 80s, when we got over 2 million visitors a year. When I arrived at Mount Rushmore in 1985, it was actually, I would say, a very it was kind of a mellow place. We had a parking capacity of about 500 cars. We had a walkway, which was the Avenue of Flags, which meandered, if you will, through the woods, but was not handicap accessible. We had a visitor center that did not have a theater. We showed the story of one of the greatest, most colossal carvings on the face of the earth. We showed it on 19-inch TV screens that people sat on little stools around in pods in the visitor center. We had the visitor center painted red so people would not stay in the visitor center very long. We were trying to encourage them to leave. We didn't have any walkways, we didn't have any trails. We had an amphitheater that seated about 600 people. All of them were over their limits in terms of the ability for people to use them comfortable, feel relaxed in their visit, and have an enjoyable visit where they could learn about the 4 presidents and their contributions to the birth, the growth, the foundation, and the expansion of our country. So what we've done is we have basically said we're going to answer that problem. We're going to provide, first and foremost, an interpretive and educational experience in line with the mission of the National Park Service. We built an amphitheater that had its capacity we over doubled the capacity of the amphitheater, and we had average attendance, that required us to over double the size of the amphitheater. We made all the walks accessible. We reoriented the visitor facilities so that the concession facility was moved back to where the visitor center was, and we put the visitor center at the preeminent location. We built a theater, we told the story, we put the exhibits in that really explain how and why Mount Rushmore was built, what does it represent, and what it represented to our country at the time that it was built, and what it represents going forward. We had some opportunities here. We had, not only did the society raise money, we were able to negotiate a concession contract, which required them to build their facilities using their funds in exchange for the business opportunity that they had at the memorial. We also did that with the parking facility. That was built through a concession contract. So we took basically about half the building costs off the table and not needing to raise funds for it, but did it through a business opportunity or through a concession contracting opportunity. But what we really did is we made the park accessible. we gave people the opportunity to take the walk along the Presidential Trail, to get new perspectives on the mountains, to really understand how big that carving is. We gave them different opportunities to visit the studio and tell a different story in the studio. But two of the bigger things that we did is we actually took care of the mountain. We hired a firm to understand the blocks of granite that make up Mount Rushmore, if they move, how stable the mountain is, and what we do to make sure it's protect its long-term integrity. We made a decision, because it was a constant issue and a constant problem, to finish the Hall of Records. Working very closely with the family of Gutzon Borglum, we made a decision that we had to preserve the history of the mountain in terms of the initial start of the Hall of Records should be preserved, but we needed to complete the concept. The theory was that there was a story to be told in unfinished dreams as well as finished dreams. The Hall of Records was an unfinished dream, but we could finish the part of the dream that told the story and make sure that that story was represented on the mountain with what we did with the porcelain panels and the markings in the Hall of Records, and how we preserved that. But at the same time, we preserved the structure of the start of the Hall of Records so that that story was told, so that people could see that it was part of a dream, part of the dream, what they did to try to accomplish it. But that dream was finished over 50 years later. So I think what we've done at Mount Rushmore is we've really made Mount Rushmore an opportunity for people to learn about their country, learn about what those 4 presidents did in terms of the history of their country, and really, I think, give them a vision for the future. I used to tell people that people took away from Mount Rushmore a lot of what they brought. And if they came there as a person, an artist, someone who painted or sculpted or did something in almost any of the arts, they'd see Mount Rushmore through those eyes. If they came to Mount Rushmore as a veteran, they saw Mount Rushmore through those patriotic eyes of fighting for the country and what that represented to them. You know, if they came just because it was a cool place to do, they probably went away with a whole different feeling. But you can go to Mount Rushmore still today, and there's literally thousands of people there at any one time during the day. And there'll be a quiet that you won't expect at Mount Rushmore, because people are appreciating Mount Rushmore for the reasons that are important to them. Mount Rushmore Society was there as a result of being an organization that was formed originally to raise money in support of Mount Rushmore, and it continued on in really a very low-key manner. I believe they had about $100,000 in the bank. They met twice a year. They funded small projects. I think they underwrote Rex Allen Smith's book was the project they were working on at the time. They did some, if you will, some very nice things for the memorial, but they were not really a big influence in terms of what happened or how things got done at the memorial. But the conversation, bringing them the idea that they might be able to attract attention, started them to think. And it was at the same time that the National Park Service overall was looking to friends groups for support for projects and necessary things to happen at not just Mount Rushmore, but parks across the country. When the Mount Rushmore Society, Ray Aldrich, I believe, was the president at the time, Carolyn Mahlers was actively involved. In the board, they sat and they listened politely. And they said, well, how are we ever going to raise money? And then we talked about things like a Mount Rushmore coin. Could we enlist congressional help? Could we get Tom Daschle and Tim Johnson and Larry Pressler, I think at the time, to help us in terms of trying to get a Mount Rushmore coin? And they were very encouraging to us in doing that. We hired the people to do feasibility studies or planning studies for fundraising, and they were hearing positive things about Mount Rushmore. And so we convinced ourselves first that it was possible. We had a pretty modest goal when we started. I think we were looking to raise less than $20 million for the kind of things that we had on the table in terms of improvements that we needed to make to parking, to access visitor centers. And we weren't talking about the kind of major renovation that we ended up ultimately did at the memorial. We were also talking about the preservation of the mountain itself. And so we had to convince the Park Service. I remember a conversation I had with the regional director, and when I was trying to convince them that this was the right thing for the Park Service to do, the right project for us to take on, and they said, Dan, the Park Service has a lot more high priority needs than Mount Rushmore. And my response was, I'm not asking for the Park Service for money, I'm asking you to approve us undertaking a fundraising effort. If we aren't successful, it's not going to cost the Park Service anything. If we are successful, we're going to have an opportunity to improve Mount Rushmore beyond anything the Park Service could have ever comprehended doing. It really became a situation that no one thought could be successful, that no one thought we could have any opportunity to raise money, and it really developed with the society's influence, the society's urging, the society's active involvement in fundraising as a campaign that would not say no or would not say they could not get it done. And the things that they did for the memorial have changed the visitor experience of Mount Rushmore incredibly forever. And the people who will benefit from that are people from around the country and from around the world, but probably more than anyone else who benefits from that are the people who live in the Black Hills in South Dakota.
Mount Rushmore National Memorial is considered one of the most recognizable iconic parks in North America. There is a high level of expectations managing an iconic park. We are committed to maintaining an enhanced level of physical security and visitor and resource protection. Mount Rushmore National Memorial has addressed and prevailed throughout the pandemic in many different ways. The staff at Mount Rushmore are some of the most resilient people you will ever meet in your life. They are truly here to serve one another and the public. The memorial made several operational changes throughout the pandemic to ensure employee and visitor safety and to support efforts to slow the spread of COVID-19. By modifying park operations as needed, Mount Rushmore was able to remain open to the public throughout the pandemic. The most recent visitor enhancement project was completed as recent as June of this year. The project addressed a $10 million deferred maintenance, along with addressing visitor safety and accessibility issues. At the same time, improving operational and energy efficiencies throughout the park. The most notable part of the project took place along the Avenue of Flags. The avenue was widened by 15 feet and existing columns were removed to make it easier to view the sculpture. All the flags with their state information were moved to parallel the walkway. This has improved visitor traffic flows and provided clearer views of the sculpture. And we have received just nothing but positive feedback of people being able to be more spread out in the avenue, and the new look is just beautiful, and it makes it easier for everyone to be able to also see the sculpture without any obstructions further back without having to go all the way to the Avenue of Flags. We strive to provide a broad spectrum of programming and information through a variety of different types of programming, including digital and media, print material including the popular Junior Ranger program, exhibits, movies, ranger-guided programming, and special events. A few examples of other interpretive programmings include the Mount Rushmore Self-Guided Tour, daily ranger and intern-led programs for youth in the Outdoor Youth Discovery Center, ranger talks in the Sculpture Studio, and for the last several years, during the summer months, 3 to 4 days a week at the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota Heritage Village, Daryl Red Cloud, the 5th generation grandson of Chief Red Cloud, and Sequoia Crosswhite, descendant of Chief War Eagle, provide interpretive programs about the history of the Great Plains people, their culture, and Sequoia also provides Native American flute music. The memorial's interpretive staff also provides an evening lighting ceremony like no other unit of the National Park Service. Every evening from Memorial Day through September 30th, there is an evening ranger-guided program in the outdoor amphitheater. After a brief ranger talk and movie, active duty and veterans of our armed forces are invited to come on stage to close the program. We are proud to commemorate and honor those who have served and sacrifice for our country. Speaking of our evening lighting program, we are going to be kicking off the beginning of the monumental movie project starting in 2022. The project will include replacing the 2 outdated movies currently being shown at the memorial. One is in the outdoor amphitheater as part of the evening lighting ceremony, and the other location is the Visitor Center Theaters. Funding for the Monumental Moving Project has been made possible by the Mount Rushmore Society and the generosity of donors. We thank you for your partnership and all your support.
Thanks to Tom, Dan, and Michelle, who have reflected on how Mount Rushmore is a lesson in ingenuity, perseverance, and resilience. Today, Mount Rushmore is home to over 3 million visitors a year, and it is the role of the Mount Rushmore Society to work hand in hand with the National Park Service to continue to promote, preserve, and enhance the programs for all. Your support provides funding for many programs at the memorial, including the Kay Jorgensen Internship Program, funding of seasonal rangers, cultural performers, the Junior Ranger Program, as well as support for the Monumental Movie Campaign, which Michelle spoke of earlier in our program. That is our legacy, and it can be yours too. Please consider donating right now to the Mount Rushmore Society so that we can continue to offer these programs to the park for the next 80 years.